welcome back to Her Story in Higher Education. I'm Dr. John L. Goins, and I'm glad that you all tuned in. You all, before we start, I want to encourage everyone to go ahead and like and subscribe to our YouTube channel at Her Story in Higher Education. Also, I want you to be on the lookout. I'm releasing my first children's book very soon on Amazon. It's called Black Girls Rising. I told you at the very beginning of this journey that my objective was to empower and inspire, and I'm still on that journey to do the same thing, but this time through children's books for young ladies. So on today's episode, we have a very special discussion. We will be discussing microaggressions, and I have the privilege of hosting two leading ladies in higher education. I have Ms. Michelle Jalali from California State University, San Bernardino. She is the Student Engagement Coordinator. I also have Dr. Christina Gladney. Dr. Gladney is a Research Associate at Tougaloo College in Tougaloo, Mississippi. Welcome, ladies, to Her Story.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you guys for taking out time. I want to highlight your story because, again, your story is always her story. So we are privileged to have you here, and we're looking forward to this conversation. So before we start, microaggressions, that conversation, that topic is not new. It's not a new topic, but it may be foreign to some. So in order to save you a Google search and a lot of reading, I'd like to yield the floor to Dr. Gladney. Dr. Gladney has a large body of research on this topic, and I want her to just give a small overview of what microaggressions are.
Okay. Awesome. And thank you so much for the awesome introduction. So hello, everyone. Just to give you a brief but thorough overview of microaggressions. A microaggression is a comment or action that negatively targets a marginalized group of people. This could be people of color. This could be a particular gender. It could be a belonging belonging to a certain sexual identity or gender identity. A microaggression can be intentional and it can be unintentional. And I think that's one thing that's to note about microaggressions. They're not always done out of callous. Sometimes people just don't know. And I'm sure we're going to get into some of that conversation later on. It's important to also know that you have different forms or contexts of microaggressions. Microaggressions can be verbal, so someone actually saying it to you. It could be behavioral, where it's embodied in a gesture, where a great example of a Black man or a person of color walking into a store that may be presumed that they may not be able to afford the items in the store, and it's a clutching of the purse or some type of body language shows fear or shows some type of negativity. And so that would be a behavior. And then environmental. And I think this is the one that a lot of people miss out on. And I think is most important for us to begin focusing more on is the actual environment in which we're in and how that promotes or does not promote inclusivity, whether it's restaurants and you look around and they have, especially in Mississippi, we still have restaurants that have, cotton picking and, plantation homes in celebration, right? It's honored and put on a showcase. And so it's being sensitive, the Black people in this community of people of color, period, that live in Mississippi. So those are the three type of forms, how it can manifest. And then the actual three types of microaggressions are micro assaults, which are intentional. Is, for instance, like a racist joke could be told, and then they say, "Oh, I'm just kidding." And we always know it's some little truth in a joke.
Right.
And so that's one side. Then you have micro insults, where micro insults are most often not intentional. They think they're actually giving you a compliment, but actually they are insulting you. For I think one of the legendary ones was for a lot of people of color, they may say, someone of the greater majority or white person may say, "Oh, you speak very well," or "You're so articulate," right?
Yes.
They're giving you a compliment, when in reality you're totally insulted. So why do I have to be called out as articulate? Why is that not a assumption? Why is it a surprise for you? And finally, that last type is a micro invalidation, which really speaks towards individual kind of denouncing a whole group of people. The assumption of a person not being able to swim just because they're Black, or a person not being able to be trustworthy because they're from a certain neighborhood or live in a certain zip code. So those are the 3 forms of microaggressions, as well as the 3 types of microaggressions, with a few examples in between. So I hope that did it justice.
It did. I mean, you did wonderful. You elaborated on so much more than I was even aware of. I respect yours because you have done so much research on it. So thank you for lending your expertise to us. I really appreciate it. So ladies, I'd like to just have a candid conversation about the occurrence of microaggressions. Of course, everyone, all 3 of us have experienced them, but because we are trying to empower and inspire, I want us to elaborate on our stories. I want us to tell our stories to those who could be looking and those who could benefit from hearing this. So let's talk about those. Even if we don't label them in the subcategories and categories that you so brilliantly put them in, let's talk about them. So I want to talk about the most egregious example. And if there's more than one, that's fine. But I want to talk about one that just sticks out in your mind that happens to you. So Michelle, let's start with you, if you would. Tell us about what happens. And if you would, please tell us, if you wouldn't mind, tell us your ethnicity, because I want those viewers to understand the connection between the marginalized populations and our participants.
Right. Yeah. So again, thank you so much. And for the context, Dr. D, that's very helpful. So, it is clear that I'm a young professional, so let me just put that out there, but I'm also Indian Jamaican, and I'm originally from Toronto, Canada, and moved to the US at a young age and did my schooling here, and then came from South Florida, moved to California. So I've had quite a bit of lived experience around how people view me in general. And one of the things that when I think about microaggressions, I think about it in a professional context quite often, because that's where I am called on to vocalize how I'm feeling and what my opinions are, but not necessarily wanting to be heard. So I sit in spaces quite often where, I pull up a seat to the table, and off the bat, and I mean physically, right? Off the bat, you're seeing the rolling of the eyes, you're seeing the kind of side eye, why is she sitting here? Why is she, and it's multiple things, right? I'm in the weeds with my students. That's what I like to say. I'm doing the work right now. I'm understanding what retention looks like. I'm understanding why it's not happening. I mean, if there's anyone to give good perspective as a person and as a professional, it would be me. However, off the bat, so some of the initial actions immediately put me in a space to not feel comfortable, right? To not even feel comfortable expressing my opinion or even saying, here are the facts, here's the data, because the data doesn't matter when it's coming out of this mouth quite often. So one of the biggest moments that I can remember in my career was, and like I said, as a young professional, it is often the excitement of coming with new ideas and being innovative, very much attacked by traditions and folks that have been in positions for a lot longer, tenured faculty and staff members, etc. And sitting in a space and discussing an initiative and hearing, please, what are all of your thoughts, and me getting excited and wanting to share something and being interrupted within probably the first 3 words that I stated in an attempt to say, let's let those who have a better understanding speak first, or let's let some of the folks. And mind you, when they're saying this, they're directing physically their body to the men in the space, and more specifically the white men in the space, the older white men in the space. And I'm sitting there like, you called on me for my opinion. I didn't get hired for this role, and I definitely did not feel confident enough to sit at this table if I didn't feel like I was supposed to be here, and I'm supposed to be here. So now you're going to hear what I have to say. And it was so embarrassing. In all honesty. It was that feeling of like, why? Tell me why. If you can articulate why, then sure, let's have this conversation, but you can't. And I know that you can't. And when you're sitting in the space where you're not just the minority in general, but you know that historically and systemically you're completely oppressed continuously. When you feel like the folks that should be advocating for you or on your team are putting you down, woo, it feels like hell.
Yeah.
You know, it feels like hell because you are called upon and then eventually pull back, right? You're saying, hey, share your opinion, share your thoughts, but not you. Or we'll hear you, but then we'll kind of pass by you. So although it's not a moment, like I said, that is reflective in all, I guess, context for me as an individual, as a person of color, a young woman, all of the identities that I hold, and as a professional who's continuously an advocate for my students, that was a moment that really shook me, really, really shook me.
Yeah. Are those continuous moments that happen? Do you feel like that's an environment or a culture that's being fostered? Or do you feel like that was just a one-time instance that they've gotten over and learned from? Or how is it? What does it feel like?
I think that, I mean, that's a great question, because culture of an organization either creates spaces that are conducive for microaggressions to continue to happen, like we just spoke about, or to make people feel uncomfortable when they do a microaggression. And a lot of the time, if you are not the one addressing it, which a lot of folks are not comfortable, right, addressing things in that space, it will continue to happen. And I do feel like, especially in higher education, where you're working against some pretty, terrible historic and systemic problems in regard to marginalized identities, even when something is addressed, unless it's coming from all angles, including from the top, it does not necessarily create the dynamic change that you need to see in order to retain staff and faculty of color, in order to retain students with different marginalized identities. So you kind of sit in this bubble. So yeah, I would say, it has continued to happen in my career. It will continue to happen in my career. But I'm thankful that I'm to the point where, I'm more comfortable addressing things, while me 4 or 5 years ago was definitely not comfortable and would sit there and quiet down and retract back into my shell. So
well, thanks for sharing that. Dr. Gladney, would you care to contribute to this conversation, to this part of the conversation?
Sure. So I think that the act, for my example, the act itself wasn't as egregious, wouldn't be defined so egregious, but I think just the, what word am I looking for? The resistance is what's so egregious. So, like, I think a lot of young PhDs, once they complete their doctoral program and they enter into whatever environment they're entering into, which most often with a PhD is in a higher education environment, if in a STEM or something like that type of. And so, you come in and you got this new title of doctor and you want to be called doctor. So I worked hard for it, right? And so I have myself personally, I attended a conference. It was the NASPA, my multicultural conference they have every other year. And it was a young lady there who presented on I'm Dr. such and such, not Keisha. That was the name of her presentation.
I love it.
Like, all right, girl, let's stay there. Because that's basically my story. I attended college at the University of Florida, which is not the most diverse place, but it was a lot of diversity within my own program. And so I left, and it's way more diverse than Mississippi. And so I left Florida and came to Mississippi and started working at a particular institution and came in and introduced myself, as Dr. Christina Gladney. And I don't think that was received as well. I think it was a culture shock on both ends. Me leaving Mississippi and had been gone for 7+ years and coming back into an environment of a very rural environment, and kind of with this Black girl magic just ready to hit the ground running. And I felt this notion of I didn't know my place. And so that was my cultural shock of like, you know, I'm just leaving this place where they were, you know, we were celebrated for being women of color and for accomplishment and achievement. And then I transitioned back home and I'm kind of shunned in this environment for that achievement and that accomplishment. And so I had, you know, to correct a couple times. My preference called to attention, I would say, my preference and what I wanted to be called. And just on a personal note and a side note, no one really calls me Christina. And so I wasn't just period used to being called Christina. And so once I came into a work environment and I had this new, educational attainment and, I'm in a professional level, I was, an administrator. And so I'm like, okay, I need, I want my respect, right? Put the respect on my name. And so I, had the conversation once or twice. And then the initial conversation I had with a particular staff member that was not superior art, like I won't say on my level, but she was below me in terms of rank. We had a conversation and I told her my preferences and she told me that I wasn't being humble. She told me that we are here at this institution to serve and we should serve like Jesus served. And Jesus was so humble that he washed the disciples' feet, and that I should evoke that same spirit. And me wanting to be called doctor is not humility, and we should be like Jesus and be humble. And that was pretty much her reasoning of why and how she justified not wanting to call or preferring to call me Dr. Gladney. For me, it's your preference. As long as it's appropriate, it's your preference. I know people who like to be called by their initials. I know people with PhDs that like to be called doctor. I know people with PhDs that don't, they don't want to be called doctor. So to me, what's most important is preference. And so I think that was so egregious to place a very whitewashed version of Christianity to place on her reasoning of why she shouldn't call me this, young Black girl doctor. And so I thought that was just very interesting, to say the least, of how much people will resist. And I think it was an internal thing. I think it was it was discourse for her, right? Like to see this Black woman who she doesn't typically see as young and a professional, and having to call her a title. And, I came from the perspective of we're in higher education. And for what was most important to me was the symbolicness of calling me Dr. Gladney. I realized that a lot of people where I'm from do not get to the point of achieving a doctorate. I'm a first generation student. I was raised by my grandparents, and a lot of people can relate to my story. And so to see me and see my accomplishment or hear my accomplishment just by my title, that can be a source of inspiration for another young Black girl who may feel as though they can't accomplish because of their circumstances. And also to take it a step further, that calling someone with a PhD or a doctorate is a part of my culture. Calling them doctor is my culture. Honestly, the first doctors that I knew were PhDs. They were people in the church who had either got a doctorate or gotten PhDs in education or whatever field. And I would always wonder, why were they calling them doctor? And that was my introduction to what doctor was outside of the medical doctor. So from a child, I've always remembered someone holding a title of doctorate being referred to as a doctor, whether they're inside of the higher ed context or education context or not. And so that's really what I was offended by. If you're in a court, you say judge. You get pulled over by the police officer, going to address him as officer, and they don't even have a degree.
Right.
So for me to spend 12 years in school and not acknowledge my hard work after 4 degrees, we have an issue. And so that's pretty much my egregious story. And like I said, it was more about the resistance and the reason behind the why. It was more of the why than the what for me. And the why can be somewhat very interesting sometimes.
So I want to contribute just a little. So I want to give just a little context to where I'm from, and it's probably not a surprise, but because my accent is so thick. But I was born and raised in the Deep South. So I was born and raised in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. I came back to Hattiesburg to get my doctorate. But the examples that I can think of right away that align with the categories that you illustrated so nicely, Dr. Gladney, in the South, I think it's traditional for I think it's traditional for our cultures to extend themselves to make it okay and make fun of African American names and try to engage African Americans in that conversation. Not only the names, but the origins of the names. You know, I bet her father's name was so-and-so, you know, if her name is Stephania or something, you know, regardless if that's just a unique name or if that's just a decision of someone's parents to name some. But I've seen that conversation happen again and again and again and again, to make fun of names, to make fun of, or to bring attention to hairstyles. I've had that experience over. And as a matter of fact, it took me a while to come to grips with my preference on hair, just because of that, just because of making that a highlight. You know, if I ever decided to do something different, it was, I can't figure out what it is different about you. So you know the identification of every dog in America, but you cannot figure out what is different about me today. You know, so you know, I see those things highlighted. And of course, I have been put on the spot for being articulate and everything. You know, I don't make a scene or anything and say, okay, well, why am I not supposed to be articulate and everything? But anyway, I think those examples are the things that I can think of that have happened to me personally. You know, I won't just highlight one example because they happen so often, and so often my not superiors, because I have a pretty good culture right now that I'm in, but so often the people that I'm around don't know that it's going on. So with that said, let's move on to what can we do about it? You know, as professionals, we have a place that we are to remain in. You know, even if we don't want to remain in it, you know, it's expected that we stay in this one place that's PC. So because we're women, and because we have a place as women, because we have a place as minorities, because we have a place as professionals, what can we do about it? I'll start with you. Jalali.
You know, that's a good question, because I think a lot of the time there's this expectation stamped on our forehead to sit on every diversity board, to sit on every whatever it might be. And oftentimes we're the ones that are like, when we're not called upon, why were we not called upon? But when we are there, we're like, okay, we're tired. We're wearing, 28 hats. Hello, can you pull somebody else in, right? And I think a part of how to address microaggressions is really around intervention. And from a cliche standpoint, talking about education is vital, but there are different layers to this. I started a consulting company, a DEI consulting company, because I was living the experience, not because I'm knowledgeable, but because I'm living the experience. And a lot of it is around, how do you check yourself and check other people and have those difficult conversations without causing tension to the point where the conversation can't occur. So starting off by saying, hey, let's talk about what my own biases are. Let's talk about yours. Let's talk about the unconscious and implicit bias. Let's unpack this a little bit, let's take this a little bit deeper. And I think, going to the next step around creating cultural shift and organizational shift, especially when you're in positions of power or you have the direct impact in an organization to, you know, specific constituents like students or whatever, you know, whoever has the most influence, I'll say. You know, really being able to say what procedures and policies do we have in place that's either allowing for things like this to happen, or ones that we can pull from to make sure that, you know, we're serving a capacity that's inclusive and equitable, right, for all minoritized groups. That's what I like to say, because that's not a decision that was made, right, by us. But I think additionally, you know, it's what can we do? I mean, when we feel the confidence to address something, we do it. And even though, like I said, we're called upon in a lot of spaces, it's for a reason, because we're the ones that are experiencing this. We're the ones that can say, hey, that's a great definition, but I'm going to tell you what it really means.
Come on. Okay.
That nice little scenario, this case study you have printed out that never happened is really great, but I'm going to tell you what it looks like in the classroom as a doctoral student or as a master's student trying to pursue further education. I mean, these are the things that we can do to create some really tangible change.
I love it. I love it. Dr. Gladney, take us on home, please.
Yes, I think intervention is absolutely necessary. In my experience, I've learned just as a researcher that a lot of marginalized experiences and studies about marginalized experiences and discriminative experiences are qualitative. And so this is where the real work needs to be done, is quantitative studies. My dissertation was a quantitative study because I wanted to show people look at numbers. Feelings don't translate as well as numbers do. And when we're in a room full of executives, in front of administrators, you need numbers. And so that was what was important to me when in my dissertation. I was able to have a sample of 220 Black professionals at a large, predominantly white institution, one of the largest of the country. And so I was able to quantitatively show the relationship between educational attainment and microaggressions, between gender microaggressions. I even looked at area of study and microaggressions. One of the most interesting findings was that business had the lowest level of microaggressions, the big areas of business. Because at the end of the day, the business people know no color is important except green, right? And so when they go China and when they go over to other countries, they have to learn the culture of that country, because that could be $1 billion deal on the line if they look at somebody or they, you know, do something wrong. And so they just have a better understanding and sensitivity of culture, because at the end of the day, it affects the bottom line. And so that leads me to my point. We have to show how it affects the bottom line. We have to show how, if your institution are continually losing African-American professors, African-American staff members, that is affecting your of Black students, your recruitment of Black students. And so that's really what we have to focus on, is that bottom line. And I also just want to add, yes, calling out is definitely necessary. Having, you know, being brave enough, being confident enough to do something and do that in a respectful manner, because you don't want to harm with harm, correct with harm. And I do want to mention that age can be a microaggression. Working in environment that may be you're the majority, right? Like you're not no longer in a majority white environment. Now you're among your people, right? And then that's where social economic status and age really plays a part. And so for us, I just want to say we need to be mindful of comments related to social economic status. Men need to be mindful of comments related to femininity or the lack of, as well as masculinity. There are a lot of toxic conversation and languages that we put out there and messages we put out there related to gender and age that I'm very sensitive to, and I know that Jalali is very sensitive to as well, as being young. And so I think it's very interesting how the EOC, their age discrimination is 40 and over, when I actually think it's 40 and under, because we get a lot of discrimination. I've been called little girl, I've been called so many things. Yeah, you should be a student. You don't, I mean, you know,
all the time, all the time.
Yeah, exactly. I was an interim vice president of a college, and they were like, "Oh, I thought you was a student, girl." You know,
Right.
so, you know, things like that. So I did want to add that, just so people don't think that we don't do it to ourselves sometimes. And then when we're amongst a more diverse environment, or an environment and we're the majority, I don't want us to turn around and do the same thing with the things that make us different, or those boxes that we put people in once we're around our own. So I just wanted to add that piece to that as well. But definitely, I say do the research, show the research, publish your research, write articles, write papers, just disseminate the knowledge as you get the knowledge. Qualitative studies are great, but we need those quantitative studies as well to create that body of evidence and show the argument isn't in our heads. This is real stuff.
I agree. I totally agree. Ladies, thank you so much for this conversation. I have enjoyed it. To my viewers, I always encourage you to remember your power. Walk in it. Own in it. Own it. It's yours. Here's to ladies everywhere. May we empower them. May we inspire them. And may we be them. I'm Dr. Johnny O'Goins. Thank you so much for tuning in to Her Story in Higher Education. Till next time, take care.